Good morning, Jennifer Brown.
Good morning, Jen Grace. Welcome, and you are in a new home, which is very exciting news for you.
Yeah, which is why we didn't have our call last week. We've been consistent since the beginning of March, and last week was the one that we missed because I was in the middle of moving and I did not actually have a desk at that point. And right now, I'm still surrounded by boxes, but at least I'm in my new office. So that is very exciting.
You look great. I love your lighting. Very
Thank
natural.
You. Yes, it's all about the lighting. Right?
It is. Yes, these are the things we obsess about in quarantine.
Yes, Brian's like shaking his head like, what have I gotten into?
Well, there was a whole conversation about lighting before we came on the call, right? So let's be real about it.
All right, enough.
It's true, because we're all like, did we look nice enough?
Did we look okay?
Gotta have good lighting and good sound, or else people don't want to. I think lighting, you can probably get away with not having the best lighting. I think sound is the key, that people want to just really be able to hear what we're all saying.
That's the most important thing.
Yes. So here we are, and we have Brian McComak with us today. Hello, Brian.
Hello, Brian.
Hello.
Good friend of both of ours. Yes. Soon to be PYP author.
Yes.
Gotta get writing.
You know, I've said this on, I think you both know I have my weekly conversation series that I host on Wednesdays, and I actually said it on one of those episodes, and I'm like, oh no, it's out there. Like, I can't take it back now.
No. Yeah, Jen called you out within the first minute and a half. So now it's
on.
There's no going back.
We do it with love, I promise.
Well, I appreciate it. Well, of course, the two of you have been so instrumental in everything I've done in the last few months. So I'm grateful, and I'm grateful for the nudges. Actually, I don't remember who introduced me to Eduardo, one of the two of you, but Eduardo is the reason the conversation in the series even exists. Like, he was the one who's like, Brian, you talked about it for 3 months. It's now time to make it happen. What's the date?
Yeah. Why don't we start off? Can you share, for those that don't know what we're talking about, what you've been up to?
Mm-hmm.
Let's just keep it a secret. It's more fun that way. Of course, you both know I like to infuse levity in life when I can. So, but yeah, no, thanks for asking. I started an organization called Hummingbird Humanity, and it's really the idea was based on my 20 plus years in human resources and diversity and inclusion work and organizational culture and employee engagement. And what I wanted to do was to build a firm and a message and a framework around human-centered workplace cultures. And so as the launch of Hummingbird Humanity, I decided that since I believe that our stories and who we are as individuals is so important to anything we do in the workplace, including the messages and the things we do externally out of our companies, I wanted to center it on the stories and experiences of diverse individuals and a diverse group of individuals. So I now have this weekly series on Wednesdays called Hope, Heart, and the Human Spirit. And I have this wonderful collection of guests who've shared their stories and their wisdom and their experiences. And going back to Eduardo Placer, who I mentioned a moment ago, the founder of Fearless Communicators, he's also been one of my mentors and supporters and champions, and he was the first guest. So if you're curious, you can check it out on the hummingbirdhumanity.com website /events, and you can get links to all of the episodes there.
I love it. And you know what? And Eduardo was, I believe, Jen, correct me if I'm wrong, I think he was the first person that we had as a guest, and everything kind of unraveled from there in our conversations, right? He was the first one, right?
I think he was. And I discovered Eduardo, I wonder if it was me, I'm not sure, but he was emceeing a women's event and that I was attending. And I walk in the room and I see this guy at a women's event. And I think this is going to have to be a super stupendous guy, and lo and behold, he of course was. I mean, we all know how magical he is as an MC. And, Brian, you actually, you have a side hustle that you love of auctioneering. So it's funny that I feel like both of you have so many talents. But you also do some auctioneering too, which I always wanted to put in.
Yeah, well, thanks for mentioning that. And well, of course, auction events don't happen right now. So I've updated my marketing materials to say, hire Brian for your live event. And we've some of us who are benefit auctioneers have pivoted to being fundraising ambassadors on live events to help ask for money. But yeah, when I worked at Christie's Auction House a decade ago, I was fortunate to be able to combine my passion for giving back, my love of performing, and my desire to understand the business of auction more. Just I wanted to understand the business, because I believe to be an HR professional, you have to understand the business. Like that's the conduit for conversations and work, and everything we do from an HR perspective needs to match the business strategy. So this was a way for me to bring these sort of connections of passion for purpose and performance and understanding the business together. And I learned from Lydia Finette, who I know that Jennifer, I don't know if Jen Grace, you know her yet, but you must know Lydia Finette. We'll have to make sure you get connected to her. So she taught me how to be a benefit auctioneer. And so for the last almost 10 years now, I've helped organizations both architect their live events, so really figuring out how do they maximize fundraising over the course of the evening, and then also I can go on stage and deliver the auction experience itself. And many times I do it on my own, and so that's where my passion and desire for having levity helps. So I call it stand-up comedy with a purpose. Although I don't think I'm very funny. So there's that sort of conundrum. But so a lot of times I do it, I do the auctions on my own, but occasionally I get to work with celebrities too. So I've been on stage with Justin Bieber, and who else? Judy Gold, Lorraine Bracco. Lorraine Bracco was so fun to work with. Alan Cumming. So I like to name drop when I can, because it makes me feel cool. I'm so not cool, but it's been fun to help these organizations that are doing good in the world to be able to continue doing that work, and they need those dollars. So it's a great way for me to be able to give back.
Yeah. Awesome. So many talents. Oh, Brian. And so that's one of the many things you do, but returning to Hummingbird, like when you say like focusing on lived experiences, how were we not focusing on lived experiences in the past? I guess, like, I think that would be instructive to people. And what do we mean by lived experience? Like, don't we all have lived experiences of our own diversity dimensions? I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate, which have been missing. What made us realize that? And how are you marching forward to use your voice to center those in a way that you think is different from what's happened up till now?
That was like 17 questions.
That wasn't I can be Jenn. Welcome to my brain, which is a really confusing place.
Actually, I do the same thing though. I'll say, I'm going to ask you a question. Okay, I'm going to ask you 2 questions. Actually, it's 5. I'm just going to figure it all out. But it'll be how many it is.
Just choose one.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, I think there's a few things in there that are themes that are helpful. So I'll start with just one of my beliefs about the workplace of today is, and there's an interesting question about whether humanity was part of our workplaces ever in a very real way.
Ooh, yeah.
I think so, because one of my first iterations of this book, the working title was Bringing Humanity Back to the Workplace. And I shared that with someone. They're like, was it there before, Brian? And so,
really?
So that title has been sunset and we've moved on to new ones. But I think it's a really interesting question. I think there are companies and organizations that infuse humanity into everything they do. So there are certainly examples of that. I think certainly that over the last few months with the pandemic and the conversations around Black Lives Matter, we're seeing more companies recognize the importance of infusing humanity into their workplaces and really being people first or people centric in their decision making and their actions and their decisions. But I also believe that human resources, as it evolved from people administration or sort of more administration practices, started to move into more human-centered, focused decision-making. So that there was this journey in the 80s and 90s that that was really the focus. So it was very, that people came first in a lot of what HR was doing. HR has been challenged to become more strategic in the work that it does and business focused. And I love that. I think that's an important evolution for HR. HR work is now very much more human capital focused. And how do you manage the financial impacts of the resources, of the people resources, is my belief. So what's happened is diversity, equity, and inclusion, those professionals are now the people who are focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but are really the barometers or the caretakers of heart and soul of companies. And so that's where I think this humanity question in the workplace comes to life. When I talk about heart and soul, though, there's a whole collection of ways that heart and soul comes to life. And where I start with is, what's the lived experiences of all of the people that work at our companies? And you're right, Jen, we all have lived experiences, every single person. And actually, the title here, Investigating the Lived Experiences of Others, the good news is that applies to every person. There's, I have a commitment as a gay, white man, and a person with a disability. I can share my experiences and my stories. But I can't speak for either of you. You're both women. You're both members of the LGBTQ plus community. But your experiences, even in the LGBTQ plus community, are different than mine. And then, all of us are having conversations now about Black Lives Matter and what are the experiences of the Black community. And then there's lots of complexity here as we think about it. But one of my commitments as an ally, an intentional ally for people of color and for women, I try to understand those stories and their experiences and find opportunities to learn about what it feels like to be in your shoes. I'll never fully understand. I can't actually step into your shoes. But I think if we can all just understand each other, when we go back to like this workplace example, sort of bringing all this together, I think what's happened is we've all started to be put in these boxes. You're a manager, you're an employee, you're an HR person, you're a marketing person, and we're like, you need to follow these rules. Well, the person who's in that box with those rules is a person. They're a person first, and they bring all of their stuff with them to work. We try to put it away, and I think we should. I think professionalism is important in the workplace. But you know what? If we understand each other as people and humans, I just wonder what's really possible if we really start from that perspective and then do good work together versus the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Wouldn't that be nice?
I would love, we've touched upon this in previous, episodes, videos, whatever. We're how many in? We don't even have a name for what this is yet. We're just
okay.
continuing to roll with it. But just kind of the differences that you might be seeing, Brian, in terms of the virtual workplace that is our current existence, and then maybe the future iteration of what that looks like, and that whole bringing your full self to the workplace. Because now, as Jenn has brought up a number of times, I feel like we can't hide ourselves as much, because we're like in our homes and you can see the things and the stuff that's going on around us while we're at work or having an important call or whatever it might be. So what are you seeing right now based on that?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I feel like there are both, as with anything, there's always the pros and cons, right? There's the things that are good, and there's the things that are posing challenges, and how do we manage through that? So in the good bucket, what I am excited about is, I've been one of these people who has really championed for greater flexibility as we integrate work and life and all of our various responsibilities and both. I believe and hope a little bit of both that corporate America and leaders in corporate America who have been resistant are now seeing, hey, actually remote working, virtual working, and flexible working, it actually really does work, and you can actually get a lot done. And sometimes you can even get more done, and you can get it done in ways that are that minimize some of the negative impacts to both people and the environment. I think about some of my friends in New York City who commute an hour to an hour and a half to 2 hours each way. That's not good for anyone, really. And so I think we're seeing the benefit of that. I also think that it's raised this whole collection, and you've said this already, Jen, that it's raised these other questions that have posed some new challenges for us. I love this phrase that I heard on, I think it was actually on one of Jennifer's calls, where someone mentioned how the soundtracks of our lives are now entering the workplace, because we're on these calls, and Bosco, my dog, hasn't appeared yet, but he might show up in a few minutes. You just never know. Or kids in the background, or individuals who live in an environment where they don't feel like they have space to be quiet space to work, or that they're proud of, that they want to show on camera, and so there's some negative impacts of that, and then we start asking questions around how will that affect their performance reviews and their potential for promotion and opportunity, and then the last thing I'll just sort of mention there is the reality is FaceTime is a thing, being visible is a thing, being heard is a thing. Like, those things are all real, and so how does that play out in this new world? How do we start to learn the skills to make sure we're inviting voices of a collection of diverse voices to conversations, particularly those who are less comfortable with being on video or camera, or sharing over the phone, or who might be introverts and just less likely to share in the first place. And now they have this barrier where they can I can just hide behind this, which might be comfortable, but doesn't necessarily help them progress their careers. So I think it's going to challenge us as leaders and organizations to think about, how do we put away some of those paradigms around FaceTime and in-person time, and really think about, what does contribution to the success of an organization, a team, or what is success of measuring success of an individual? What does that look like? And I think we're still figuring that out. That's all new, but I'm hoping we can find the balance of providing flexibility in new ways that allows people to still thrive. I don't, by the way, answer any question with a straight answer. There's not. There's here's the 17 things that are in my head.
Oh, yes.
You're in good company, though. I often say, when I'm talking to anybody, as I'm about to go on some random ramble, I will say my brain works like fireworks. So once it's ignited, I've got more ideas than I can contain, and I'm going to try to get them all to you. But there might be some
misfires
in all directions, honestly. So
I'm going to steal that.
Yeah. Hopefully those who are watching are following.
Totally. Well, and one of the things before we joined the call that Jennifer mentioned, if I was going to break down all of those, the thinking that I just shared to a core concept, and I want to give credit to Jennifer for saying this, of the concept of empathy, I think is going to be really important. Even more so, I would have said it was always important. It's not a new concept, but having empathy for the different experiences and how this new reality works or doesn't work for others, I think is going to be important. And understanding that you don't live in someone else's shoes, but they need to be seen and heard. I think that's another example of empathy. I'm a huge fan of the Jennifer Brown consulting framework of welcomed, valued, respected, and heard. I use it all the time, and try to make sure I give credit, because I think it's so important. That is true for all of us. But I think when I think about the action of empathy, that sort of is an underpinning value for each of those experiences as we're showing up in work and showing up in life. So, as a offer for those of you watching who are curious, the Brene Brown video on empathy on YouTube, which is a 3-minute video that's depicted with a cartoon, is something that I go back to a lot, just for myself, to remind myself, what does it mean to be empathetic? How do I demonstrate that day to day?
I love that. I have a question for both of you, if you don't mind. I'm curious how you think, I don't want to say new forms of discrimination, but maybe different takes on the same type of discrimination may or may not increase as a result of being in these virtual environments. With Brian, when you were talking about just kind of introverts versus extroverts, I'm thinking in terms of promotion and access to additional opportunities and things like that, where once upon a time you would have that FaceTime with somebody, the whole water cooler chat and that type of stuff. Do you are either of you kind of predicting that different forms of that might actually kind of take place in this virtual environment?
Yeah, Brian, I'll go first with my thoughts on this, because it is something I worry about. Those casual encounters that were facilitated in the physical world, we now have to create those intentionally. So I think that the manager skill set is going to change to the being sort of the promoter and the sponsor of their talent in order to ensure visibility in this virtual world. They've got to be way more intentional, like literally like setting goals. I would boil it down to actual metrics. I mean, I would say like, here's my team here, or my colleagues, here's what I'm doing to get them in front of certain people so that they're seen and valued and thought of when promotions and advancement discussions are happening. But it's going to be much harder, I think, to do this. And that means that leadership needs to really step up and add some self-accountability for that to their job description, to say like, I've got to work harder, because we are at risk already. Those of us who are diverse, I hesitate to use that, but those of us who are underrepresented in the workplace and underestimated, which is another word I really like, we fall out anyway from the process and from the pipeline, even in the sort of optimal circumstance of the physical. And actually, there's some things that are not optimal about the physical workplace either, right? In terms of access and visibility. So I'm thinking a lot about this being a it means we have to be, and we always needed to be more intentional about elevating talent. We always needed to do this better. So now we just have a different palette that we have to work with. And I'm intrigued to think about like, well, what does that mean on a day-to-day basis when somebody does really good work? Like, what do you do about that? Like, do you connect somebody by video for like a mentoring chat? Like, do you sort of intentionally, I love the idea of reverse mentoring as well, like the reverse teaching, like flip it over so that it's more democratic, because I've been thinking about that a long time too, to say like, hey, the senior person is not always a mentor. And I think we've got to, for diversity's sake, we got to really flip that 180 degrees to say like, there's so much knowledge and there's the most kinds of diversity that's overtly being shared in the sort of more junior, sort of emerging leader contingent. And how can we put those folks in some kind of a driver's seat to be teaching so that it's more flat and more 360 degree. It's a long answer, but I think we've got to think about talent, like visibility of diverse talent, because we have to counteract the fact that we are becoming more invisible. We are at risk of becoming more invisible. And we, meaning those of us who are not seen very often, who aren't really understood, whose lived experiences haven't like had the chance to generate that empathy. So yeah, I think, but maybe Brian, some organizations are also doing a really amazing job in the virtual world of this, because we've got more FaceTime on the screen. We've got Zoom meetings where we check in with everybody. So maybe it's not one voice, it's more democratic. Maybe we do have more access actually at the same time, which is an enabler of what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say I agree with everything you've just said, and particularly around the skill set that's going to be required from leaders and managers and facilitators of conversations, of really engaging the voices in the room. And I know we've had a conversation in the DEI space in particular around diversity, equity, and inclusion. For anyone who may not be familiar with that acronym, there's been people who've said that the Zoom world is the great equalizer in many ways, and we have to be careful about that, because as Jenn Grace mentioned a few minutes ago, we're entering people's homes. However, to Jennifer's point that she just made a moment ago, which I think is really interesting, is we all have the same size of a box. We all have the ability to say something in chat or to say something, out loud in that room. And so I think in some ways it can be an equalizer in taking out some of those physical manifestations of power in the organization, which could be really interesting. The two other things that I'll just mention briefly here are, one of the questions that's come up is there were high performers who struggle with this remote or virtual work environment. And so what's the impact on them? But the reverse is true as well, right? There are people who in the virtual environment will be more successful. So how do we provide flexible environments going forward? And what does that look like? I think are more questions than others. The other one though, that I think is, I don't know if it's new discrimination, but it's certainly challenging, is outside of the workplace context, is there are a lot of kids in our world, particularly in the United States, also, which is where I have more knowledge around, is who don't who go to school to get access to a computer or to get access or to get good food. And as I think about long-term impacts of what's happening with the pandemic, that I do worry about the amplification of impacts to marginalized communities who don't have, who those kids don't have access to what they need for sustenance or for education, or so much happens in the virtual environment now. So that I think I worry about that, and I wonder what can corporate America do to help to solve that problem.
Yeah, you both said so much. I feel like if no one is working on this yet, there should be some kind of thought leadership around what this looks like in terms of what maybe this is a new JBC thought leadership piece. I don't want to call it a white paper because I think you moved away from using the phrase white paper, but something to the degree of giving organizations kind of practical guidance on what are some of these best practices so people aren't getting left behind in this new virtual world that we're living in, since I think it's pretty well agreed upon that we're going to be in COVID for quite a bit longer. So I feel like we're going to have to figure these things out. I feel like there's not much of a choice.
Yeah, Jennifer, I'm curious if I love that question, because what I know that I've heard a lot about is the navigation that HR leaders and business leaders are grappling with around physical safety of the return to the office conversation and those conversations. So they feel like they're the focus and not this other, and I'll put it in the words I've been using of like this impact on just the humanity, the people. It's how do we keep them safe, which I think is respecting human life. And I want to acknowledge that, but there's this deeper question that Jenn's raising. Have you heard conversations about that in your circles?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think. I mean, the whole question of how work gets done. Who do you need? Who's your work team? Like, how do you need to be physically co-located in order to produce things successfully, or actually, is the work product the same or better with a virtual team? I mean, and then bringing portions of the workplace back to work, but having them be distanced. Like, what does that do to collaboration and a sense of belonging? So it's a really like fascinating question. And then, I don't think anyone's really asking like, the question is like, where do you do your best work? How do you do your best work? With whom? What would the scenario that would make the most sense for you from a productivity standpoint, but not just I love this. I'm thinking about this word extract a lot. I feel like capitalism is about extracting. It's extraction. Like, what can I get from you? How can I justify my giant office building, real estate costs by like forcing people to come back in? It feels like the tail is wagging the dog here. And it's definitely not about, we're not being asked. I don't know. I mean, Brian, you might know more about like HR surveys that are going out to give people as much agency as they deserve to design the way and the place that they work. This should always have been the conversation. I mean, we've been a virtual team for a decade. And so the question is, when you get the work done, what are your rhythms? How do you like to be communicated with? Do you like to be on camera or not? When are your best, most productive hours during the day and night? How can we sort of give you just enough so that you're not overwhelmed? And if we need to reapportion work, like I need to know that so that we can share workload more. It's like this is such a golden opportunity to revisit a lot of these things that haven't worked for a lot of us. But I'm not sure. I don't have the confidence in organizations that we are putting the human first. Sadly, I think if I had to guess, I think we're probably doing the most expedient thing, which is often the tail wagging the dog of humanity. It's all these other things, the pressures of the sort of running the business and extracting and profit and whatever it is that are not putting us first. And that really does worry me tremendously. It's almost like the mentality, well, you're just lucky to have a job, and it's a total lack of investigation into what makes us tick and what makes us creative and how can we be most comfortable so that we can be creative. I mean, we have to be comfortable. Like people with disabilities, I think a lot about, if we can stay in this virtual world, the commute goes away, which is problematic for a lot of people for employment. And the issue of accommodations in workplaces that weren't built by and for people with disabilities goes away because you can have your accommodations at home. And so just thinking about that as an example of like, what are the accommodations for all of us? Like, what do we need to feel maximally creative and present and focused? And then what is the company's role should be to provide that and let us design it? I mean, that's really what we should be talking about. But I'm curious, are you seeing the same thing or predicting the same thing?
Yeah. You asked this question around the surveys that I've seen, and certainly there are, so I've had, as HR is a big part of my community, and so I've had conversations with my HR colleagues, and I've heard moments where they are leading into that humanity element of it, of like the flexibility and the experience and the impact to individuals who, the virtual environment doesn't work for them. So I've heard hints of those moments, but the conversation is really around expediency for return to work and safety for return to work. And again, I want to acknowledge that safety is about humans. So there is a human component to that. But it is more about the practicality of where we're working and how we're getting work done rather than it is centered from how do we help the humans that work at our company, the people that work at our company, be able to do their best and balance that. And I think there are companies that are doing a really nice job. I think some of the social media companies, Twitter, for example, they've said, we're just going to say you can work from home. And I suspect that they'll open their offices and they'll provide virtual workspaces. This is me hypothesizing. I have not read this about Twitter, but I can see them having hot desks to say, hey, if you need a place to work, we'll have it for you. And I suspect that they're going to equalize their organization of, you have a variety of ways you can work here. Doesn't surprise me that our social media or technology companies are going to lead the way on that because they tend to be more comfortable with sort of challenging the norm. But I agree with you, though. Unfortunately, which is all about why I started this effort with Hummingbird Humanity, is we seem to default back to how do we make money? What does that look like? And I get that most of our organizations are for profit, and even those that are not for profit still have a budget they have to hit. But I just believe there's a better way to do that. If we start with the humans in mind, then we can actually accomplish those goals that are the bottom line measurements. So I'm hopeful that we can get to that place.
Great last point.
Yeah, I was going to say, I have so many more things that I would love to ask and say, but I know that we are at the top of our time. And if I asked what I wanted to ask, we would be going for an extra 20 minutes, and we're all running out of time for that. So, Brian, this has been a great conversation.
Well, of course. Well, I always enjoy my time with both of you, individually and together. As I said earlier, it's you guys. I'm trying not to use you guys. The two of you have both been instrumental in my journey as a consultant over the last few months. So I appreciate it. And I'm just going to make one challenge plug here, because Jen Grace, you challenged Jennifer Brown about doing a thought leadership paper. I feel like you work at an organization where you help people write things for a living. So maybe that should go that direction too. But
collaborate. Maybe this is the beginning of a birth of something new between the three of us and whomever else we need to rope into it. I know, Jen, I feel like you and I are very good at luring people into our ideas.
Yes, we are. Come into our lair.
Well, I hope you both have a good rest of your day and rest of your week. And then, Jen, I know you and I are planning on having one of these conversations next week, and then we might be taking a short summer hiatus because we're trying to just figure out calendars and schedules. And it is, even with COVID, it's a little bit tricky with folks. So we might be on a break for a little while, but we will be back next week with at least one more of these, and then we might be gone for a little bit.
Awesome.
But yeah, not gone forever though.
Not gone forever. Just taking a little break. Thank you, Brian, for joining us.
Thank you.
So interesting. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Have a good day, both.